Manfred Albrecht Freiherr von Richthofen, also widely known as the Red Baron, was a German fighter pilot with the Imperial German Army Air Service during World War I. He is considered the top ace of the war, being officially credited with 80 air combat victories. Originally a cavalryman, Richthofen transferred to the air service in 1915, becoming one of the first members of Jasta II in 1916. He quickly distinguished himself as a fighter pilot, and during 1917 became leader of Jasta 11 and then the larger unit Jagdgeschwader 1. By 1918, he was regarded as a national hero in Germany, and well known amongst opposing forces. Richthofen was shot down and killed near Amiens on April 21, 1918. There has been considerable discussion and debate regarding aspects of his career, especially the circumstances of his death. He remains perhaps the most widely known fighter pilot of all time, and has been the subject of many books, films and other media. Name and nicknames: Richthofen was a Freiherr, a title of nobility often translated as Baron. This is not a given name nor strictly a hereditary title since all male members of the family were entitled to it, even during the lifetime of their father. This title, combined with the fact that he had his aircraft painted red, led to Richthofen being called the Red Baron, both inside and outside Germany. During his lifetime, however, he was more often described in German as Der Rote Kampfliger. This name was used as the title of Richthofen's 1917 autobiography. Richthofen's other nicknames include Le Diable Rouge, or Le Petit Rouge in French, and the Red Knight in English. Early life: Richthofen was born in Klinberg, near Breslau, Lower Silesia, into a prominent Prussian aristocratic family. His father was Major Albrecht Philipp Karl Julius Freiherr von Richthofen and his mother was Königin von Schickfuss und Nudorf. He had an elder sister, Ilse, and two younger brothers. When he was 4 years old, Manfred moved with his family to nearby Schweidnitz. He enjoyed riding horses and hunting as well as gymnastics at school. He excelled at parallel bars and won a number of awards at school. He and his brothers, Lothar and Bolko, hunted wild boar, elk, birds, and deer. After being educated at home, he attended a school at Schweidnitz before beginning military training when he was 11. After completing cadet training in 1911, he joined an Uhlan cavalry unit, the Ulanen Regiment Kaiser Alexander der 3. Von Russland NR1 and was assigned to the regiment's 3. Escadron. Early war service: when World War I began, Richthofen served as a cavalry reconnaissance officer on both the Eastern and Western fronts, seeing action in Russia, France, and Belgium. However, with the advent of trench warfare making traditional cavalry operations outdated and inefficient, Richthofen's regiment were dismounted, serving as dispatch runners and field telephone operators. Disappointed and bored at not being able to directly participate in combat, the last straw for Richthofen was an order to transfer to the Army's supply branch. His interest had been aroused by his examination of a German military aircraft behind the lines, and he applied for a transfer to Die Fliegertruppe in des Deutschen Kaiserreiches, later to be known as the Luftstreitkräfte FTE. He is supposed to have written in his application for transfer, "I have not gone to war in order to collect cheese and eggs, but for another purpose." In spite of this unmilitary attitude, and to his own surprise, his request was granted, and he joined the flying service at the end of May 1915. Piloting career. From June to August 1915, Richthofen was an observer on reconnaissance missions over the Eastern Front with Feldflieger 80 Lung 69. On being transferred to the Champagne Front, he is believed to have shot down an attacking French Farman aircraft with his observer's machine gun in a tense battle over French lines. However, he was not credited with the kill, since it fell behind Allied lines and therefore could not be confirmed. After a chance meeting with the German ace fighter pilot Oswald Boelk, Richthofen entered training as a pilot in October 1915. In March 1916, he joined Kampfgeschwader 2 flying a two-seater Albatros C. Initially he appeared to be a below-average pilot. He struggled to control his aircraft, and crashed during his first flight at the controls. Despite this poor start, he rapidly became attuned to his aircraft. Over Verdun on April 26, 1916, he fired on a French Nieuport, downing it over Fort Douaumont, although once again he received no official credit. A week later, he decided to ignore more experienced pilots' advice against flying through a thunderstorm. He later noted that he had been lucky to get through the weather, and vowed never again to fly in such conditions unless ordered to do so. After another spell flying two-seaters on the Eastern Front, he met Oswald Boelcke again in August 1916. Boelcke, visiting the East in search of candidates for his newly formed fighter unit, selected Richthofen to join Jagdgeschwader II. Richthofen won his first aerial combat with Jasta II over Cambrai, France on September 17, 1916. Boelcke was killed during a mid-air collision with a friendly aircraft on October 28, 1916. Richthofen witnessed the event himself. After his first confirmed victory, Richthofen contacted a jeweler in Berlin and ordered a silver cup engraved with the date and the type of enemy aircraft. He continued this until he had 60 cups, by which time the dwindling supply of silver in blockaded Germany meant that silver cups like this could no longer be supplied. Richthofen discontinued his orders at this stage, rather than accept cups made in pewter or other base metal. Instead of using risky, aggressive tactics like his brother Lothar, Manfred observed a set of maxims to assure success for both the squadron and its pilots. He was not a spectacular or aerobatic pilot, like his brother or the renowned Werner Voss. However, he was a notable tactician and squadron leader and a fine marksman. Typically, he would dive from above to attack with the advantage of the sun behind him, with other Jasta pilots covering his rear and flanks. On November 23, 1916, Richthofen downed his most famous adversary, British ace Major Lano Hawker VC, described by Richthofen himself as the British Boelcke. The victory came while Richthofen was flying an Albatros DII and Hawker was flying a DH-2. After a long dogfight, Hawker was killed by a bullet in the head as he attempted to escape back to his own lines. After this combat, Richthofen was convinced he needed a fighter aircraft with more agility, even with a loss of speed. He switched to the Albatros DE in January 1917, scoring 2 victories before suffering an in-flight crack in the spar of the aircraft's lower wing on January 24. Richthofen reverted to the Albatros DII or Halberstadt DII for the next 5 weeks. He was flying his Halberstadt when, on March 6, in combat with Fe. 8's of 40 Squadron RFC, his aircraft was shot through the fuel tank, probably by Edwin Benbow, who was credited with the victory. Richthofen was able on this occasion to force land without his aircraft catching fire. Richthofen then scored a victory in the Albatros DII on March 9, but since his Albatros DE was grounded for the rest of the month, Richthofen switched again to a Halberstadt DII. He returned to his Albatros DE on April 2, 1917 and scored 22 victories in it before switching to the Albatros DV in late June. From late July, following his discharge from hospital, Richthofen flew the celebrated Fokker Dr. I triplane, the distinctive 3-winged aircraft with which he is most commonly associated, although he did not use the type exclusively until after it was reissued with strengthened wings in November. Despite the popular link between Richthofen and the Fokker Dr. I, only 19 of his 80 kills were made in this type of aircraft. It was his Albatros DE serial number 789/16 that was first painted bright red, in late January 1917, and in which he first earned his name and reputation. Richthofen championed the development of the Fokker DV with suggestions to overcome the deficiencies of the then-current German fighter aircraft. However, he never had an opportunity to fly the new type in combat as he was killed just days before it entered service. Flying Circus. In January 1917, after his 16th confirmed kill, Richthofen received the Paul Aumar Copyright Right, the highest military honor in Germany at the time. That same month, he assumed command of the fighter squadron Jasta 11, which ultimately included some of the A copyright-like German pilots, many of whom he trained himself. Several later became leaders of their own squadrons. Ernst Udet belonged to Richthofen's group. At the time he became a squadron commander, Richthofen took the flamboyant step of having his albatros painted red. Thereafter he usually flew in red-painted aircraft, although not all of them were entirely red, nor was the red necessarily the brilliant scarlet beloved of model and replica builders. Other members of Jasta 11 soon took to painting parts of their aircraft red. Their official reason seems to have been to make their leader less conspicuous, and to avoid him being singled out in a fight. In practice, red coloration became a unit identification. Other Jastas soon adopted their own squadron colors, and decoration of fighters became general throughout the Luftstreitkräfte FTE. In spite of obvious drawbacks from the point of view of intelligence, the German High Command permitted this practice, and German propaganda made much of it. Richthofen being identified as der Rote Kampfleiter, the Red Fighter Pilot. Richthofen led his new unit to unparalleled success, peaking during bloody April 1917. In that month alone he downed 22 British aircraft, including 4 in a single day, raising his official tally to 52. By June he had become the commander of the first of the new larger Jagdgeschwader formations, leading Jagdgeschwader 1, composed of Jastas 4, 6, 10 and 11. These were highly mobile, combined tactical units that could move at short notice to different parts of the front as required. In this way, JG-1 became the Flying Circus, or Richthofen's Circus, its name coming both from the unit's mobility and its brightly colored aircraft. Richthofen was a brilliant tactician, building on Boeilk's tactics. Unlike Boeilk, he led by example and forcible rather than by inspiration. He was often described as distant, unemotional, and rather humorless, though some colleagues contended otherwise. He circulated to his pilots the basic rule which he wanted them to fight by: aim for the man and don't miss him. If you are fighting a two-seater, get the observer first. Until you have silenced the gun, don't bother about the pilot. Although he was now performing the duties of a lieutenant colonel, he remained a captain. The system in the British Army would have been for him to have held the rank appropriate to his level of command even if he had not been formally promoted. In the German Army, it was not unusual for a wartime officer to hold a lower rank than his duties implied, German officers being promoted according to a schedule and not by battlefield promotion. For instance, Erwin Rommel commanded an infantry battalion as a captain in 1917 and 1918. It was also the custom for a son not to hold a higher rank than his father, and Richthofen's father was a reserve major. Wounded in combat. On July 6, 1917, during combat with a formation of Fe. 2D two-seat fighters of No. 20 Squadron RFC, near Wervik, Richthofen sustained a serious head wound, causing instant disorientation and temporary partial blindness. He regained consciousness in time to ease the aircraft out of a free-falling spin and executed a rough landing in a field within friendly territory. The injury required multiple surgical operations to remove bone splinters from the impact area. The air victory was credited to Captain Donald Cunnell of No. 20, who was himself shot down and killed a few days later. The Red Baron returned to active service on July 25, but went on convalescent leave from September 5 to October 23. His wound is thought to have caused lasting damage as well as a change in temperament. There is even a theory linking this injury with his eventual death. Author and hero, during his convalescent leave, Richthofen completed an autobiographic sketch, Der Rote Kampfleiter. Written on the instructions of the press and intelligence section of the Luftstreitkräfte FTE, it was heavily censored and edited. An English translation by J. Ellis Barker was published in 1918 as The Red Battle Flyer. Although Richthofen died before a revised version could be prepared, he is on record as repudiating the book, stating that it was too insolent, and that he was no longer that kind of person. By 1918, Richthofen had become such a legend that it was feared that his death would be a blow to the morale of the German people. Richthofen himself refused to accept a ground job after his wound, stating that the average German soldier had no choice in his duties, and he would therefore continue to fly in combat. Certainly he had become part of a cult of hero worship, assiduously encouraged by official propaganda. German propaganda circulated various false rumors, including that the British had raised squadrons specially to hunt down Richthofen, and had offered large rewards and an automatic Victoria Cross to any Allied pilot who shot him down. Passages from his correspondence indicate he may have at least half believed some of these stories himself. Death. Richthofen was fatally wounded just after 11:00 am on April 21, 1918, while flying over Moulinaut Ridge, near the Somme River. 49 degree 56 a euro squared 0.60 a euro cubed N2 a degree 32 a euro squared 43.71 a euro cubed E. At the time, the Baron had been pursuing a SUP with Camel piloted by a novice Canadian pilot, Lieutenant Wilfred Watmay of No. 209 Squadron, Royal Air Force. In turn, the Baron was spotted and briefly attacked by a Camel piloted by a school friend of May's, Canadian Captain Arthur Roy Brown, who had to dive steeply at very high speed to intervene, and then had to climb steeply to avoid hitting the ground. Richthofen turned to avoid this attack, and then resumed his pursuit of May. It was almost certainly during this final stage in his pursuit of May that Richthofen was hit by a single .303 bullet, which caused such severe damage to his heart and lungs that it must have caused a very quick death. In the last seconds of his life, he managed to make a hasty but controlled landing in a field on a hill near the Bray-Corby Road, just north of the village of Vaux-sur-Somme, in a sector controlled by the Australian Imperial Force. One witness, Gunner George Ridgway, stated that when he and other Australian soldiers reached the aircraft, Richthofen was still alive but died moments later. Another eyewitness, Sergeant Ted Smout of the Australian Medical Corps, reported that Richthofen's last word was "caput." His Fokker Dr. I, 425/17, was not badly damaged by the landing, but it was soon taken apart by souvenir hunters. No. 3 Squadron, Australian Flying Corps, as the nearest Allied air unit, assumed responsibility for the Baron's remains. In 2009, Richthofen's death certificate was found in the archives in Ostrogub Wielkopolski, Poland. Richthofen had briefly been stationed in Ostrogub Euro, which was part of Germany until the end of World War Euro before going to war. The document, which is a one-page, handwritten form in a 1918 registry book of deaths, misspells Richthofen's name as Richthofen, and simply states that he has died April 21, 1918, from wounds sustained in combat. Controversy and contradictory hypotheses continue to surround the identity of the person who fired the shot that actually killed Richthofen. The RAF credited Brown with shooting down the Red Baron, but it is now generally agreed that the bullet that hit Richthofen was fired from the ground. Richthofen died following an extremely serious and inevitably fatal chest wound from a single bullet, penetrating from the right armpit and resurfacing next to the left nipple. Brown's attack was from behind and above, and from Richthofen's left. Even more conclusively, Richthofen could not have continued his pursuit of May for as long as he did had this wound come from Brown's guns. Brown himself never spoke much about what happened that day, claiming, "There is no point in me commenting, as the evidence is already out there." Many sources, including a 1998 article by Jeffrey Miller, a physician and historian of military medicine, and a 2003 U.S. Public Broadcasting Service documentary, have suggested that Sergeant Cedric Popkin was the person most likely to have killed Richthofen. Popkin was an anti-aircraft machine gunner with the Australian 24th Machine Gun Company, and was using a Vickers gun. He fired at Richthofen's aircraft on 2 occasions, first as the Baron was heading straight at his position, and then at long range from the right. Given the nature of Richthofen's wounds, Popkin was in a position to fire the fatal shot, when the pilot passed him for a second time, on the right. Some confusion has been caused by a letter that Popkin wrote, in 1935, to an Australian official historian. It stated Popkin's belief that he had fired the fatal shot as Richthofen flew straight at his position. However, in the latter respect, Popkin was incorrect. The bullet that caused the Baron's death came from the side. A 2002 Discovery Channel documentary suggests that Gunner W.J. Snowy Evans, a Lewis machine gunner with the 53rd Battery, 14th Field Artillery Brigade, Royal Australian Artillery is likely to have killed von Richthofen. However, Miller and the PBS documentary dismiss this theory, because of the angle from which Evans fired at Richthofen. Other sources have suggested that gunner Robert Buey may have fired the fatal shot. There is little support for this theory. Nevertheless, in 2007, a municipality in Sydney recognised Buey as the man who shot down Richthofen, placing a plaque near Buey's former home. Buey, who died in 1964, has never been officially recognised in any other way. The commanding officer of No. 3 Squadron AFC, Major David Blake, initially suggested that Richthofen had been killed by the crew of one of his squadrons RE-8s, which had also fought members of Richthofen's unit that afternoon. This claim was quickly discounted and withdrawn. Following an autopsy that he witnessed, Blake became a strong proponent of the view that an AA machine gunner had killed Richthofen. Theories about last combat: Richthofen was a highly experienced and skilled fighter pilot, fully aware of the risk from ground fire. Further, he concurred with the rules of air fighting created by his late mentor Boelk. Boelk advised pilots not to take unnecessary risks. In this context, Richthofen's judgment during his last combat was clearly unsound in several respects. Several theories have been proposed to account for his behavior. In 1999, a German medical researcher, Henning Olmers, published an article in the British medical journal The Lancet, suggesting it was likely that brain damage from the head wound Richthofen suffered in July 1917 played a part in the Red Baron's death. This was supported by a 2004 paper by researchers at the University of Texas. Richthofen's behavior after his injury was noted as consistent with brain-injured patients, and such an injury could account for his perceived lack of judgment on his final flight, flying too low over enemy territory and suffering target fixation. Richthofen may have been suffering from cumulative combat stress, which made him fail to observe some of his usual precautions. One of the leading British air aces, Major Edward McManus, was killed by ground fire on July 26, 1918 while crossing the lines at low level, an action he had always cautioned his younger pilots against. One of the most popular of the French air aces, Georges Gannema, went missing on September 11, 1917, probably while attacking a two-seater without realizing several Fokkers were escorting it. There is a suggestion that on the day of Richthofen's death, the prevailing wind was about 25 mph easterly, rather than the usual 25 mph westerly. This meant that Richthofen, heading generally westward at an airspeed of about 100 mph, was traveling over the ground at 125 mph rather than the more typical ground speed of 75 mph. This was 60% faster than normal and he could easily have strayed over enemy lines without realizing it, especially since he was struggling with one jammed gun and another that was firing only short bursts before needing to be recocked. At the time of Richthofen's death the front was in a highly fluid state, following the initial success of the German offensive of March-April 1918. This was part of Germany's last opportunity to win the war. In the face of Allied air superiority, the German air service was having difficulty acquiring vital reconnaissance information, and could do little to prevent Allied squadrons from completing effective reconnaissance and close support of their armies. Burial. In common with most Allied air officers, Major Blake, who was responsible for Richthofen's remains, regarded the Red Baron with great respect, and he organized a full military funeral, to be conducted by the personnel of No. 3 Squadron AFC. Richthofen was buried in the cemetery at the village of Batangles, near Amiens, on April 22, 1918. 6 of No. 3 Squadron's officers served as pallbearers, and a guard of honor from the squadron's other ranks fired a salute. Accounts that the honor guard were Australian infantry are apparently based on the fact that in photographs and film of the event they are wearing AIF uniforms, complete with slouch hats. This is simply because members of the AFC, which was part of the Australian Army, wore normal Army uniforms. Allied squadrons stationed nearby presented memorial wreaths, one of which was inscribed with the words, "To our gallant and worthy foe." A speculation that his opponents organized a fly-past at his funeral, giving rise to the missing man formation, is most unlikely and totally unsupported by any contemporary evidence. In the early 1920s the French authorities created a military cemetery at Frankfurt, in which a very large number of German war dead, including Richthofen, were reinterred. In 1925, Manfred von Richthofen's youngest brother, Bolko, recovered the body from Frankfurt and took the Red Baron home to Germany. The family's intention was for Manfred to rest in the Schweidnitz cemetery, next to the graves of his father and his brother Lothar, who had been killed in a post-war air crash in 1922. The German government requested, however, that the final resting place be the Invalidenfriedhof Cemetery in Berlin, where many German military heroes and past leaders were buried, and the family agreed, Richthofen receiving a state funeral. Later the Nazi regime held a further grandiose memorial ceremony over this grave, erecting a massive new tombstone with the single word, Richthofen. During the Cold War, the Invalidenfriedhof was on the boundary of the Soviet zone in Berlin, and the tombstone became pockmarked with bullets fired at attempted escapees to the west. In 1975, the remains were moved to a family plot at the Zaun-quartered Friedhof in Wiesbaden, where he is buried next to his brother Bolko, his sister Elizabeth, and her husband. Number of victories. For decades after World War I, some authors questioned whether Richthofen achieved 80 victories, insisting that his record was exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Some claimed that he took credit for aircraft downed by his squadron or wing. In fact, Richthofen's victories are unusually well documented. A full list of the aircraft the Red Baron was credited with shooting down was published as early as 1958 with documented RFC-RAF squadron details, aircraft serial numbers, and the identities of Allied airmen killed or captured. 73 of the 80 are listed as matching recorded British losses. A study conducted by British historian Norman Franks with two colleagues, published in Under the Guns of the Red Baron in 1998, reached the same conclusion about the high degree of accuracy of Richthofen's claimed victories. There were also unconfirmed victories that would put his actual total as high as 100 or more. For comparison, the highest-scoring Allied ace was Frenchman René Copyright-Vonck, with 75 confirmed victories and a further 52 unconfirmed behind enemy lines. The highest-scoring British Empire fighter pilots were Canadian Billy Bishop, who was officially credited with 72 victories, James McCudden, with 57 confirmed victories, Canadian Raymond Calisle with 60, and Mick Mannock, with 61 confirmed victories. It is also significant that while Richthofen's early victories and the establishment of his reputation coincided with a period of German air superiority, many of his successes were achieved against a numerically superior enemy, who were flying fighter aircraft that were on the whole better than his own. Honors, tributes and relics. Relics: Captain Roy Brown, who was officially credited with shooting down Richthofen, donated the seat of the Fokker triplane in which the German flying ace made his final flight to the Royal Canadian Military Institute in 1920. Decorations and awards: Prussian Order Paul Aumar Copyright Right, January 12, 1917. Prussian Order of the Red Eagle, 3rd class with crown and swords, April 6, 1918. Prussian House Order of Hohenzollern, Knight's Cross with swords, November 11, 1916. Prussian Iron Cross, 1st class, September 23, 1914, Prussian Iron Cross, 2nd class, September 12, 1914, Bavarian Military Merit Order, 4th class with swords, April 29, 1917. Honor Cup for Victory in Aerial Combat, Duke Kaldward Medal with Swords Clasp, November 9, 1916, War Merit Cross for Heroic Act, Brunswick War Merit Cross, 2nd class, Wound Badge in Black, Saxon Military Order of St. Henry, Knight's Cross, April 16, 1917. Wang-1-Quarter-Rottenburg Military Merit Order, Knight's Cross, April 13, 1917, Seix-Ernestine House Order, Knight 1st Class with Swords, May 9, 1917. Hess General Honor Decoration, for Bravery, Lip War Honor Cross for Heroic Deeds, 2nd Class, October 13, 1917. Schoenberg Lip Cross for Faithful Service, October 10, 1917. Bremen Hanseatic Cross, September 25, 1917. La 1 Quarterbeck Hanseatic Cross, September 22, 1917. Hamburg Hanseatic Cross, Austrian Order of the Iron Crown, 3rd class with war decoration, August 8, 1917. Austrian Military Merit Cross, 3rd class with war decoration, Bulgarian Order of Bravery, 4th class, June 12, 1917. Turkish Imshiz Medal in silver with sabers, Turkish Liaquat Medal in silver with sabers, Turkish War Medal, November 4, 1917, German Army Pilot's Badge, German Army Observer's Badge, Austrian Field Pilot's Badge, tributes at various times. Several different German military aviation Geschwader have been named after the Baron. Jagdgeschwader 132 Richthofen, a Wehrmacht aviation unit. Jagdgeschwader 131 Richthofen, a Luftwaffe, Jagdgeschwader 2 Richthofen, a Luftwaffe, Jagdgeschwader 71 Richthofen, a the first jet fighter unit established by the post-World War II German Bundeswehr. Its founding commander was the most successful air ace in history, Erich Hartmann. In 1941, a newly launched Kriegsmarine seaplane tender was also named Richthofen. The engine of Richthofen's Dr. I was donated to the Imperial War Museum in London, where it is still on display. The control column of Richthofen's aircraft can be seen at the Australian War Memorial, in Canberra. The Royal Canadian Military Institute, in Toronto, holds 2 parts of the aircraft, its seat and a side panel signed by the pilots of Brown's squadron. Published works: von Richthofen, Manfred, Captain. Barker, T. Ellis, Translations. Gray, C.G. Preface and Notes, editor of the aeroplane. The Red Battle Flyer. New York, Robert M. McBride and Company at Project Gutenberg. See also, List of victories of Manfred von Richthofen, List of World War I flying aces, The Red Baron in popular culture. The Red Baron, a film released in 2008, which is largely fictionalized, von Richthofen in Brown, a theatrical film released in 1971, spanning the time from just before von Richthofen's first confirmed kill until his death. This film is also very inaccurate from an historical point of view. References, Notes. Citations. Bibliography. External links: Nova, Who Killed the Red Baron? Complete text of The Red Fighter Pilot by Manfred von Richthofen at the War Times Journal. Combat record, historic footage of Manfred von Richthofen posing and conversing with fellow pilots, circa 1917. Silent historical film of the 1918 funeral of Captain Baron von Richthofen provided by Australian Screen Online, footage of the reburial of the Red Baron in 1925.